All right, thanks everyone. Hi. So we are going to talk a little bit about sovereignty and what it means for your cloud architecture. So first, let's introduce ourselves a little bit. My name is Krijn. I am a solution architect. So I work with the customers of my company, DR Insight, which means that I sit with our customers and come up with the architectures that they need to support the solutions to the problems that they are facing. So I deal a lot with observability, I do a lot with data analysis pipelines, and so forth.
Now, we're going to do this. This is going to be interesting. So we have a mic issue, but we're going to try this. Hi, I'm Wouter. I'm a consultant, agile coach, technical coach, and I mostly deal a lot with legacy systems, both in code and in infrastructure. And what we're going to be talking about today, as Krijn said, is sovereignty. Let's see if this works. Yeah. And sovereignty is all about moving cloud infrastructure back on our own soil. We've all, or at least a little nearer to our own soil. We've probably all gone through all of these processes of getting into the cloud, but now the political situation has changed and we may have to lose some of the things that we've gotten used to. From my point of view, I'm always working with people with dealing with legacy systems, and I'm always working with how do we abstract away from our dependencies. So for me, that's the core of my interest here. And
It's all part of the fun, isn't it? And for me, my interest in sovereignty comes from basically my interest in infrastructure. Like I said, I deal a lot with designing solutions and architectures for customers. And part of that is designing them in such a way that they are ready for the future. Currently, we're at a unique point in the history of cloud technology where, you know, as a community, we've realized that we need to change the way we use cloud technology in order to ensure that the owners of the data actually can fully control who has access to that data. So there's a couple of factors that helped us realize that. And a lot of that is politics. We've seen a lot of changes on the world stage, but it basically, one big watershed was back in 2018 when in the United States, the Cloud Act was ratified. And the Cloud Act basically says that any United States law enforcement agency using the proper channels can get access to US-based hyperscaler systems. So anything that's on there can be accessed by United States law enforcement, even if physically the hardware or the data is stored somewhere else. So that was back in 2018, but more recently this has been gaining a lot more attention. Somebody was elected in the United States who has, let's say, less compunctions than his predecessors in using the instruments at his disposal to force the way that he wants things to go. So, for example, the Dutch Parliament has been asking questions. In the Dutch Parliament, there have been questions asked: what happens if our friends in America decide to pull the plug? And this has actually already happened. You probably have seen in the news that the Microsoft-based email of one of the main people in the International Court of Justice in The Hague was blocked by Microsoft simply because the US president decided, he made a decision that forced Microsoft to do that. So they do have that power. They do have that power to pull the plug on access to cloud-based resources. Now, there are, of course, a couple of different ways to deal with that we would like to get into. Please.
Oh, sorry.
Next.
And next, sorry. Yeah. First though, like I said, we've all gone through some of these changes of moving into the cloud before, and I'm sure everyone here has already been involved with things like COVID and making sure that we have actually a level of compliance that we need. And so this can feel like a big step back. And maybe some of you are like me and you hope that this will just go away again. At some point they'll have another election in the US and everything will be fine again. But if you've ever gone through some of these risk management processes, you know that once the risk assessment has changed, the way that you have to deal with it changes, and that will continue going forward. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because what this means is work. We need to be able to maybe do some things differently, or even be able to do things differently. But that at the let's say that everything goes back to normal, at the very least, you'll be in a better position to negotiate your next contract with GCP or AWS. Let's see. Oh, this was you again.
So as Wouter mentioned, you've probably all were present for part of the journey into the cloud. There was at one point, most software was self-hosted, some companies started using data centers, but then because the hyperscalers offered an economic incentive, it was often cheaper to move to the cloud. It was often more easy to deal with large architectures supported by the hyperscalers. So there was quite the incentive to start moving into the cloud. And in that process, since we've seen that lawmakers have started to realize that there is some need to have some control as to where your data lives and who has access to it, they have started to create some certifications, some regulations around that the hyperscalers had to adhere to. But these regulations are only just now starting to become more widespread. And even with those regulations, and those regulations are backing up a little bit, the hyperscalers have been offering tools around sovereignty. You can control in a pretty fine-grained way where your data lives. You can even, with some hyperscalers, specify, I want only, excuse me, frog in my throat, I only want customer service people working with my data who are of a certain nationality. All of that can be specified, but there is still that pesky Cloud Act in the background, which always leaves that back door open for American law enforcement. In any case, there are regulations and they are continuously being developed. They are part of the hyperscaler effort in dealing with sovereignty. But, Joe, you would think that part of the problem is solved. But that still leaves some risks that need to be addressed.
Yes. Anyway, yeah. And again, the important thing to realize is that none of this is new, right? I remember 7, 8 years ago, I was working with a small fintech here in Amsterdam, and they had gotten on the bad side of the Dutch National Bank, which happens if you don't have control over your data and your infrastructure, and you've got the potential of losing that data. So I was hired to revamp their infrastructure to take care of that. And that worked very well, but when we got to talk to the auditors of the Dutch National Bank, they said, okay, so cool, you've got all this now as the infrastructure as code, you've got it running on GCP. So what happens if it's no longer legal to use Google? And this was 8 years ago, right? This is part of the normal thinking process. And luckily in that case, I could say, okay, I've got my touch surface with GCP over here, but the customer actually had to deal with the Google Cloud before that, so I've got the implementations of that. I can also deploy this thing on the Oracle Cloud, and I know exactly what I need to do to migrate to something new. So you have an answer. But these sort of questions have been there in the background, especially for financial organizations already. With, like Krijn was saying, there's new regulations, like the DORA regulations at the European level, that will make those things relevant for a much larger part of the companies. And unfortunately, though back then the risk of one of the clouds becoming illegal was fairly low, now it may be a little higher. So what does that mean? There's the risk for your data. Who can access your data, or can you access your data? We're all very worried about having a ransomware attack, but what if the ransomware attack is Donald Trump saying the Netherlands is not number 2 after all? And then this is continuity. Can someone access your data? Is a security risk. Can you actually continue running your systems if someone pulls the plug? And there's just compliance, which is a reflection of both of those risks. But you need to be able to have a story on how you deal with that. And that can be a little daunting, because if you have to actually deal with this, most of us, when we've been moving towards the cloud, we've been very open in embracing all the possibilities that our cloud providers have given us. So the coupling that we have there is fairly tight. The good thing is that not all of these things are as relevant for everyone at the same time, and not all of them have to be handled in one go. We're just trying to scare you now so that you can start thinking about this, right? That's the point of this talk, is, oh my God, we really need to start planning ahead and see what we can do about this. And we're going to just give you some of the things that you can start doing right now that can prepare you and that can limit the risks, which means another mic change. But there we go.
Yay. As Wouter said, luckily, you don't have to address all of these risks at the same time. So the strategies that we are about to give you do not need to be used all at the same time. They all address different pieces of the risk environment that live around sovereignty. So let's look at some of them. One strategy, or one category of strategies to mitigate the sovereignty-related risks is architecture. You can design your infrastructure in such a way that you minimize sovereignty-based risks. And the two major categories of architecture strategies I would like to talk about is using hybrid cloud type design principles and also make use of edge computing. So to start with hybrid cloud for a little bit, hybrid cloud, the terminology taken at face value just means that you have an infrastructure that mixes public cloud resources and private resources, either being on-premise, on your own premise, or in your what is called private cloud in a fleet of servers that you yourself control. But for our purposes, looking at this from a sovereignty perspective, I would like to narrow the definition a little bit. So I would like to narrow it to the point where it means that let's start by an example. So in our first speaker talked about doing development in the cloud. And so if you have your cloud-based development, you could choose to have your complete development environment and your test environment in a public cloud. And you could use dummy data there. You could use data there that is not sensitive in any way, that does not impact your business. And when you ensure that your sensitive data lives on an infrastructure that you yourself control, you can deploy the features that you've developed into your production environment, which is then not part of that public cloud. So that would be one example of using hybrid cloud design principle to address sovereignty. And there are drawbacks, of course. If you do something like that, your scalability might be impacted. So the non-public, let's put it another way. So when you have your development environment in a public cloud, you could, for example, publish to a production environment that is not on a US-based public cloud, but for example, on a European-based cloud provider that does match the principles of your organization and is not subject to things like the Cloud Act. Another example of using an architecture principle like this, or another architecture principle, no, I'm not done yet. Sorry about that. Would be, we also saw a little bit about in our first talk about microservices-based architecture. So if you, looking at it from the opposite direction, if you have a scaled infrastructure in a public cloud, you might have your sensitive information live within a microservice that can be addressed from that cloud. So if you have the proper authentication, there would be ideally no way for the scaled services to access the sensitive data on your private infrastructure that is not authorized. The other architecture principle that I'd like to discuss is edge computing. So related to hybrid cloud, but edge computing really in the definition I would like to use here means that you deploy your software that accesses the sensitive data to specific devices. And so one example would be if you have a kiosk where, for example, patients in a hospital could have their blood pressure read. That is sensitive data, and that could be stored either locally or sent to properly controlled private infrastructure. But you could still do the orchestration from a public cloud, and you could still do the deployment to those kiosks from a public cloud. Another example is something that I've worked with in the past, which is for predictive maintenance, you can train your machine language models in the cloud, because that is something that requires a lot of resources, and then deploy it to devices. And in the case that I worked on, this was devices that were measuring the airflow in air purifying systems on top of tunnels, highway tunnels, and then would try to predict when those need to be maintained. If that would be considered sensitive, those measurements, you would make sure that they can never be accessed through that public infrastructure. So on to the next mitigation strategy. There you go.
Yep. And if you've got, again, this is the theme of this is you need, and this is not unfamiliar, you need to think about how you set up your systems. And from my part of that, I'm always very much interested in how we deal with abstraction layers within our systems. Pablo had a great talk about how to do the DevX experience for deployment development. And he was talking about building the right abstraction layers in. And this is really important. Unfortunately, in a lot of situations, one of my clients currently, they have 500 developers working across something like 60 teams, and they're all using infrastructure as code. But what it means there is that they've got 60 teams. They have 48 different Kubernetes clusters with services running in them. And all of these development teams are managing their own Terraform scripts to set up their environments, being exposed to all of the details and not building, we should be closer. But if that's where you are, then your options are limited. Infrastructure as code is code. And you need to do the same things you do with any other code. You build abstraction layers, you isolate components, and you make sure that you encourage reuse. Because if you do need to change, you need to be able to enact on that change at the right level. And that right level is not always the level that is provided to you by GCP or AWS. A lot of the services that we use from our cloud providers are wrappers around existing open source systems. It's okay to use the wrapper as long as you know when you're doing it, right? And this is, again, you become conscious of that so that you can isolate when you are creating a dependency on your cloud provider, and so that you can step away from that. That's not always easy. I know this. We're trying to trigger you to start the thinking process of seeing what you can do within your own systems. It's a lot harder to replace your IAM system or your API gateway. And because of that, another part of what you need to do is, smooth, right?
Super smooth, is simplify. So the point here is, there we go. Your infrastructure gains complexity, it becomes harder to move. One way of dealing with sovereignty issues is make sure that in case something happens, in case a hyperscaler becomes unavailable, you are able to quickly move. So that is the third strategy, really. And of course, the first part there is you don't necessarily need a hyperscaler, right? A lot of organizations decide, okay, we're doing everything on AWS, and that becomes the default, but there are other providers as well. And in not all cases, you actually need the enormous scale of an AWS or a Google. You might be perfectly fine doing it on a European-based cloud provider. Yeah, over-architecturing, that's the point we already made. The simpler it is, the more portable an infrastructure becomes. Don't just use things because they're cool. And yeah, the third point goes back to, of course, the first speaker and the cloud-based development. That does not always need to be done on a hyperscaler. It can be done with other providers as well.
And finally, change will happen. New regulations will come. Most of those regulations will require things from you. changes to your infrastructure, to make changes to how you deal with risks, changes to your architecture so that you can prove you can deal with those risks. There might also be opportunities for regulation that actually is more aimed at the tech companies, at the cloud providers. One thing that would really be a major boost for being able to have European cloud providers is more focus on interoperability, right? The fact that we have these thin layers around our open source projects also means that it's not just convenience, it's also a locking mechanism, right? You're being locked in. So regulations around that could really help and could open up that market and make it easier for players to enter the market. We run out of time, so we're going to close up. You want to?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, it's important to remember it's a journey. You don't need to solve this all at once. This has just started gaining a lot of mind share in the public consciousness. So, right now, a lot of organizations are just at the start of beginning this. But having said that, it's good to start taking this into account as soon as you can. As the Dutch saying goes, which means to govern is to look ahead. When you are designing new infrastructure, when you are making plans for expansion, when you're scaling up, our strong recommendation is take sovereignty into account. And with that, I would like to open up the floor to questions.